Today,
Da-da-da-da.
I have to remember it's today, not just tonight, on account of the fact we have a worldwide audience and different time zones. Wouldn't it be useful if everyone chose one time zone? Let's have Mongolian time as the common factor between all things. But for now, it's just today. We're evening, early evening. America's God knows what. It's America doesn't know where it is at the moment,
No.
and depending on which part of the globe you are, and India, it's about midnight, so we're 11 o'clock. Anyway, that's all irrelevant. It's me waffling. Um, so and there would have been David Thompson, but he got so sick about the results that he can't be here anymore, and he's taken himself to bed for the next 4 years. Um, hopefully we'll see us at the festival. Um, so not that I'm biased at all. And this is an apolitical platform of which I shall maintain my apoliticalness. Nah. And anyway, we have with us tonight the amazing, the incredible Sarah Lloyd Wender. Now, would you care to tell us a tale or two?
I'd love to. Thank you very much. Whoa. Well, welcome to what feels like my little cave in South Mims because it's jolly cold all of a sudden and it's grizzly and grey outside. And so I felt like I needed to create a warm atmosphere for tonight. And today I have been in a big stone building. You know, you go to a cathedral and you need to put your jumpers on because it's cold. But there we've been doing some funny stories, funny peculiar and funny ha ha. So this is a story that I have prepared for a trail to go round the cathedral. Once upon a time, some time ago, in a different place, there was a forest, a beautiful forest, a forest that you could run round and play in, a forest that had no barriers, a forest that anybody could walk in. And into this forest every day walked two little girls. They'd played there in the summer when it was hot and the leaves were green on the trees. And as it got to autumn, they still ran out into the forest to play every day. But now, it's getting darker. But they still went out to play. And on this day, they hadn't realised quite how dark it was. And suddenly, in the dark of the forest, everything started to change. Leaves that had been green looked grey. Bushes that had been green and brown looked black and white. Brambles that you had been able to see suddenly just trapped your leg. And the pathway, well, that disappeared totally. And suddenly the big one grabbed the little one's hand and the little one said, "We're lost." But the big one said, "We may be lost, but we are not scared." No, said the little one, "We're not scared." And they held on tight to each other as they walked through the wood, not knowing where they were going quite. And then the little one said, "I can hear a snuffling." "Yes," said the big one, "I can hear a snuffling too." And the little one said, "It's a hedge pig." But the big one wasn't having that. "No, it's a hedgehog," she said, being a bit pedantic. "I know, but, you know, it's not what we want. We can't call things what they shouldn't be. We can't do that." "Okay," said the little one, "I won't call it a hedge pig. But it really is a hedge pig. I like hedge pigs." So they followed the hedgehog, because they knew hedgehogs always went the same route, and perhaps the hedgehog would get them out of the forest. So they followed along. Then the big one said, That's not a hedgehog snuffling. That's a badger. Black and white badger with that long nose and the black little nostrils at the end. Very smart black and white he is, and not smelly like the North American skunk. Bit bigger and chunkier. Then the little one said, "There's a fox. The orange fox with his bushy tail." And suddenly they could hear more noises and more chattering, and around them there seemed to be lots of things. Movement, animals, even birds. And they seemed to be pushing the two little girls further and further and further into the woods. And they kept going. And then in the distance, just a little way ahead, they could see a green space where all the trees had pulled back. And there was grass. Well, it would have been grass if you could see it in the daylight. But there was a funny light in there, like people had lanterns. And they kept walking with all the animals, and then the little one pulled the big one back. "Stop," she said. "Don't go in there." And they stopped and they looked. Now, when you're playing in the forest, the animals might be slightly dangerous, but you know who they are. But people often are very dangerous. And suddenly they had seen people. But they looked carefully. They said they look like Morris men. Look, they've got bells. But then the little one said, "They're a bit odd for Morris. They're green everywhere. Green from their toes to their nose." "Yes," said the big one. "And look at that. That looks as if the green's growing right out of their mouths." And they were watching so closely and leaning forward. They didn't know somebody was creeping up behind them. And suddenly they jumped as they were tapped on the shoulders. And a voice said, "Who are you?" "Ah, ah." "We're sisters," they said, and pulled themselves together close. "And we're lost." "Lost," said the voice. "Lost where?" We got lost in the forest," they said. Then the strange green people, one of them, moved towards them, the biggest one, the giant one. And suddenly they realized they were being gently pushed and moved into that green space. And the big giant came and leaned in and said, "What are you doing here?" We're lost," they said again. "Really?" he said, and then turned to the other Morris who were behind him. And they muttered to themselves, "Well, they're here now. You can't get rid of them. They won't know what's going on. It'll be all right." And so another of the green Morris, who were very strange, came forward. And she said, "Come with me. Come and sit over here." And they sat them on a big tree trunk, which seemed very cosy once they'd got there. And they covered them round with leaves, and it was nice and warm. "Now you sit here, me dearies," she said. "We're just going to be dancing. You just watch quietly here, and we'll sort you out soon." And then she walked away, and they lined up like Morris. And that's when the big one said, "You know, they're all oak leaves. Look, if you look, they've got oak leaves everywhere." And they watched and they looked, and it was true. And then the music started. But it wasn't that quick jig that normally happens. No, it was gentle and slow and swaying and careful, and they moved carefully in between. There was none of the skipping, hopping Morris that we often see. It seemed to be calm and quiet and gentle. But then the music changed. The music became sharp. And the little one said, "Look, there's more, but they're different." And this group was very different. This group was all dark green and shiny. When you looked at them, they looked slightly different. "I know what it is," said little one. "They look younger." "Yes," said the big one. "Yeah, they do. Look, he's sort of not quite grown up. He's all stringy and long and pulled out. And the oak, they're all big and lumpy." "Yes, it's quite funny," said the little one, "isn't it?" And they lined up, the two groups of dancers. And then the big giant oak, well, he walked out. And he faced one of the tall, stringy ones who were so dark green. "The holly!" "It's the oak and the holly," they said, the girls. And that's when they started to fight. Oh, they pulled out big sticks, and they struck, and they struck, and they moved, and they struck, and then they got faster and faster and faster, and suddenly everybody, all of them, seemed to be spinning and jumping and turning and flying almost. Not really flying, but almost. It was so quick. But then in the middle of it, the big giant oak man seemed to crumble and fall, and his group picked him up and carried him out. He was gone. And then the tall, thin, stringy holly walked over to them. He said, "What have we here? Have you been watching?" "Yes," said the girls, "we got lost." "Don't worry," said the holly. "I'm sure we can sort it. You have a rest." And he picked up a blanket and tucked them in. And you know, they were very tired. And they seemed to drift off. But suddenly they were woken up. And suddenly in front of them was their big sister, and she was not calm at all. "Where have you been?" she said. "Everybody's been looking for you for hours. Get up now." And she shook them both, and she scurried them out. "Come this way, you will be in such trouble." And out of the green, along a pathway. They weren't that far away from home. Well, perhaps they didn't tell anybody that day or the next day about the dancers, but they did tell them later. Because if they didn't tell about the dancers, how do we know? And that, said the big one, is how the winter changes to the summer, isn't it? And the summer changes to the winter. The holly changes to the oak in the spring, and the oak changes to the holly in the winter. And that is the story of how the holly king rises and the oak king falls. And it happens every year, the change of the green man. The green man, a great wooden sculpture who hangs on the wall of the cathedral where I was today. Thank you very much. So, that's the holly and the ivy, or the holly and the oak. But in the winter, it's more like the holly and the ivy, isn't it? We like the holly and the ivy are the things around here that's still green. And the oak is going yellow and brown, and the leaves are drifting down. And I don't know if you can hear, but behind me, the church bells are playing. We had a few weeks when it was quite quiet, but they're back to practicing on a Friday at 6 o'clock now, just at the right time for stories. So we'll move on and we'll have a story all the way from the Sami people. From the Sami people in northern Sweden and on into Finland and across into Russia. And this is a tale from there. There once was a young man who thought a lot of himself. He had a good herd of reindeer. He had a good, strong tent. And he was very proud of himself. And he walked the woods day and night, thinking about how he'd like to conquer the universe and never quite managing it. Then one day, when he was out walking in those deep and beautiful woods, he saw a moose. Now, actually in Sweden, you can see a moose, but this was a special one. This was white. From its soft nose to its beautiful horns, to its long sloping back, it was a special white moose. And it lifted its feet carefully, almost too carefully, almost as if it wasn't quite touching the ground. But the young man must have made a noise, because the moose disappeared, ran into the undergrowth and wasn't seen. But a moose is very important. Oh yes, he would like a moose in his herd. He might even like a moose for dinner. So the young man would keep coming back to the same place to see if he ever saw the moose again. And about a month later, not only did he see the moose, but he saw 4 white reindeer. It was a silvery night with the moon coming down, and the silver of the moon shone on the white of the moose and the beauty of the reindeer, and he really wanted them. And again they seemed to walk as if on air, their gentle feet. But the boy, he was too noisy. He cracked the branches, he stamped his feet, and the animals ran. He knew he needed to develop better techniques. He knew he ought to be there earlier and wait for them. So he decided it would be a month and he would be there early. So a month later, there he was. He'd parked himself under a big bush much earlier in the day, and he waited and waited, and he was rewarded as the moon came up and the silver of the moon came across the wood. He could see the gentle shapes appearing. There was the moose. There was the reindeer. And this time in their midst was a young woman. And her hair was blonde as blonde could be, as blonde as mine is dark. And she was fair and young and light. And she seemed to skip between the moose and the reindeer, wandering between them, twisting and turning and laughing. And they ignored her gently. They obviously loved her because they nudged up against her, but they didn't take any notice at all. But the boy, he wanted all of it. But he didn't move this time. He didn't leap out like he had done before. He'd learned his lesson. You leap out, they disappear. He thought, if I catch her, perhaps I catch all of them. So carefully, he crept and he crept, and he crept, and he did. He caught the beautiful young woman, wrapped a string around and around and around. And as he dragged her through the forest, holding on tight to the string, the moose and the deer walked gently behind, but still in that strange way that suggested they didn't quite walk on the ground. Now the young man took his captive back to his tent, a tall tent covered with the deer of the reindeer, all the way round, beautifully shaped, with tall twigs inside. The tent was warm and cosy, and when they got inside, he looked closely at the young woman he had captured. She looked at him, and there was neither fright nor terror. She just looked at him. She assessed him. "You did well capturing me," she said. "I didn't hear you." And neither did the beasts. "You know, you have done well. But to keep me here, that is more difficult. To keep me here, you have to close the smoke hole." Now imagine, in the past, people had houses with fires in the middle and no chimney. I have a chimney, so the smoke goes up the chimney. Other people in this day and age have central heating. No smoke. But in that tent, in that time, in that forest, there was a fire in the middle of the tent to keep it warm and cook everything. And at the top of the tent was an opening to let the smoke out. Otherwise, you were cooked like a kipper, and you smelt like a kipper. And that's not very pleasant. Pleasant. But the young woman said, "To keep me here, you need to close the smoke hole for 4 days. If you manage to keep the smoke hole closed for 4 days and stay inside, then I will stay with you." Well, the young man thought this was amazing, and this was going to be really, really easy. Anyone can do that, he thought. So he pulled the skin up over the smoke hole. "I won't light such a big fire," he thought. "But when you don't like a big fire, there's nothing to cook on and it gets very cold." They survived the first day. They were slightly smoky, but it was okay. On the second day, it was more uncomfortable. There still had to be wood on the fire. It seemed to get more and more dense inside. But they survived. The third day was not good. Inside the tent now was foggy and misty. You couldn't see from one side to the other. Your eyes were stinging all the time, crying, tears rolling down. The boy thought, "Am I going to last? This is much more difficult than I thought it was." And then on the fourth day, the boy could not bear it. The boy could not bear it at all. His eyes were crying. He couldn't see anything. He was covered in smoke. It all stank. It was horrible. And so he went outside and he pulled the rope to open the smoke hole. And as he opened the smoke hole, the moon shone in. And the rays of the moon shone right the way down through the smoke and the smog and the fog to the girl, who smiled. And she reached her hands as if that moonlight was a rope. And she twisted her hands round it, and she climbed up and up the moonlight. saying, "I'm coming, mother." And behind her came the moose and the reindeer. And you remember they never quite looked as if they walked upon the ground. And now they walked up and up the moonlight, up into the sky and away. And that is how the young man never captured the daughter of the moon. Thank you. And everybody stank of smoky kipperiness, I think, by the end. You know, it's like when you're little and you go to camp for the weekend. And I always thought baked beans round the campfire would be lovely. I hate smoked baked beans round the campfire. And I was doing a workshop today, and I told a story, and then the children were developing the story and told me the story back. And one little girl said, there was a bit when the mother and the child put a tent over the back of a cart, and they're in the cart. And the girl said, at first it was cosy, and then when it got cold, it was not cosy at all. It was very cold, and camping was not fun. And I thought this was a lovely example of somebody who'd actually been camping and didn't like it. I will move on to another story now. And this is a story again. See, I've spent too much time in this great big building. We decided today this building that I was in was 3 double-decker buses high. It's that big. But in the nave, as the children pointed out, and it was very clever of them, all the pillars are different. You know, when you go to these big buildings and they're all the same all the way along. Well, they're not in St Albans, because there was an accident and one of them fell down. So they rebuilt it, and it's one of them slightly different. So this is a story that features one of the pillars. Once upon a time, St Albans Cathedral was not a cathedral, it was an abbey. And when it was an abbey, it had lots of monks, and it was a very, very wealthy abbey. Kings came, princes came, queens came to stay. And when they came to stay, they gave gifts. And sometimes the gifts were fine linens, and sometimes they were gold, and sometimes they were silver. There was a king who eyed up all this money and thought, I would like this. I've just made myself head of the Church of England. I think I'd like the money of the church too. And the place where the biggest load of money is, oh, it's all those monasteries. So he decided to get rid of the monasteries. And so his men went into the monastery and they took everything that they could move and they sold it off. Well, of course, the people of the town never believed that the monks were that stupid that they let them take everything. And there are many tales of how the monks hid things. And there are many tales of the people who went looking for what the monks had hidden, the gold and the silver. And this is one. This man had heard tell that underneath the abbey there was a big cave. And this is where they used to bring the corn from the mill at the bottom of the hill up a long tunnel and put it underneath the nave, because it was cool and dark, and therefore they could store things there. Quite a normal occasion, really. Well, what had once been the mill is now called the Fighting Cocks, a very, very old pub. And at the time of the story, the man believed that if you got in to the Fighting Cocks and came up that tunnel, you'd get to that cave, and that must be where they hid some of the gold and silver. Those monks never gave it all up. So one Saturday night, the man went to the Fighting Cocks. He sat there, drinking and having a meal, but not too much, because he had things to do. As everybody else kept drinking and drinking, he looked around, and at a quiet time he slipped downstairs. He went down underneath until he found the cellars. And in the cellar he went right to the back furthest corner, where he found a tunnel. And late at night, by the time that everybody else was in bed, this man crept up the tunnel, up the hill on this long tunnel, till he got to an area underneath the nave. Now, by now, it was very late, and the man was quite tired, and he thought he'd have a little bit of a rest, what we would call 40 winks sleep. So he curled up in his coat, wrapped round him to have his 40 winks, putting his little lamp down next to him. When he woke up, it was pitch black, and he couldn't see anything. His candle had gone out. He couldn't find things to light. The whole space was dark. There was no light anywhere. He couldn't feel the walls. And he started to panic. He was deep underground. What happens if the walls fall in? That feeling of claustrophobia was rising. And he made his way across the room until he found a wall. He pushed at the wall. He couldn't get out. He knocked at the wall. But then he put his ear to the wall. It was Sunday morning, and on the other side of the wall, people were singing. They were singing hymns, and he could hear them. So he waited till they finished the hymn, and then he let out the loudest screams and bellows he could. Help, he was screaming. Help, help, let me out. I'm trapped. I'm trapped in here. Help, help. Well, strangely enough, the people who were on the other side didn't think, oh, there must be a man in the pillar. They thought, oh, devils! At which point, half the congregation ran for the door. Those on the other side couldn't hear. They continued thinking it was all a bit odd and started singing again. The man stopped. But as soon as quiet time came, again he was screaming and shouting and knocking on the wall. And again people nodded, oh no, it's devils. But this time somebody listened. And as they got closer and closer to the pillar, they could hear it, the knocking and the shouting. Eventually, by the end of the service, somebody had gone and found a big spade and a hammer. And they listened and they listened. And eventually somebody dug away a few stones and he popped out his hand. Well, that was a relief. It wasn't a devil. It was an idiot human being. And it was said on that Sunday morning, they opened the pillar and let the man out. But the bishop was not having any more of this. And on Sunday, the following week, everything was back to normal. Everything had been covered over, and every trace of the tunnel had disappeared. It was all blocked up. But of course, it never stopped the treasure seekers. And in some places you can still hear stories about when somebody found some treasure that belonged to the monks of the abbey. I like that story. I like to think of the people sitting there on the Sunday morning thinking, oh, quiet time. Well, the cathedral's quite big and the grounds are enormous, and the grounds go down to Verulamium Park, where there's lots of Roman buildings, and there's Roman Bath, and a lovely place where you can go and see a mosaic in the garden. And the mosaic has leaping fish and things like that. And it's just an amazing bit of history. And then you walk out the other door of the cathedral and you go up the hill and you go into 21st century town, bustling, especially on Saturdays, with the market. And my final story is all about a later time in St Albans. And this is recently in the big museum there. They've got an exhibition about breaking the chain. It's all about people being imprisoned. And this is a little story about a woman who got involved in something in St Albans in the past. It is 1649. And in 1649 in St Albans, well, in all of England, there was a civil war. But it was very strong in St Albans because they had all the Roundhead troops there, all the parliamentary men. And it was a time when there were many whispers. And it was a time when it was not good to be a witch. Elizabeth Nott was a young woman. She didn't even know what was wrong with witches. In her life, witches were the people that gave you a charm, that gave you some medicine, because there weren't that many doctors. And when you needed something to cure you, you probably went to the cunning person. Well, the local cunning person at that time in that part of St Albans was a man, John Palmer. He'd been a cunning man for nearly 60 years. But things were different. The Roundheads didn't like witches, and the Roundheads talked about them badly. They weren't good people. And so trade had dropped, and poor John Palmer was not earning any money. He earned so little money that his landlady put a lock on his house, and he was kicked out, and he had to go and stay with family. He was very angry. He didn't stay with Elizabeth Nott's mother, but her mother said she was to talk to him and be kind to him because he was in hard times. So when he asked her to make a little doll, she didn't think anything of it. She just made what is called a puppet, a little doll. But then he said, "Come, come, we're going to do something with it." She didn't know what was going on. And he went into the big room in the house, because there were only two rooms, the up room and the down room in this house. And he lit the fire and he brought it up big and big. And we know now from our earlier stories how if the smoke doesn't go up the chimney, it goes round the room. And John Palmer was throwing water on the fire to make the steam come up. And he got that beautiful little puppet that Elizabeth had spent all that time making, and he threw it on the fire. And he started saying these strange words and shouting about Goodwife Pearls who'd kicked him out of the house. Elizabeth didn't know what was going on. And then her little puppet, which she'd made of solid clay, exploded. Bits went everywhere, bits of drying clay all over the place. And she ran out of that place and down the road. Now, you remember there were all those troops there, and they soon heard the gossip that a cunning man had made a puppet against somebody. And so he was brought before them accused of witchcraft. Well, he was an old man and he was not quite there anymore. He kept forgetting things and he told terrible tales. But what did they do to Elizabeth? They did what they called swimming. You see, if somebody was accused of witchcraft, they might put them in a pool of water. They threw her in a pond, and if she sank, well, she was totally innocent. But if she swam, oh, she was guilty. Somehow Elizabeth knew. She sank. But she crawled out later. She escaped and went and hid and was a very sensible young woman. But John Palmer was not. He told terrible tales about how he could conjure frogs out of the darkness, how he had somebody called Jezebel who would look after him, how lots of other people were witches. It wasn't good for him. He didn't get away with it. But we actually don't know what happened. He was taken before the court, but they had other things to do at the time. He was lucky. Because down the road in that great big building, the size of 3 double-decker buses, they were deciding the fate of the king. There was a conference of the army, and Lord Fairfax was across the road, and the army kept saying, "We want the king condemned." So John Palmer and Elizabeth Knott quietly slipped away into the night. And that's the story of John Palmer and Elizabeth Knott in 1649 in St Albans, escaping. And I think that's probably the end of me, is it? Oh no, I could tell one little more story. Do you want one little more story? Or have we all gone to sleep? One little more story. I don't know what. Baba C is attacking the world in general. It's very interesting. There's all sorts of shenanigans going on there.
One more story. One more story. One more story.
Oh dear. Oh, it's all madness round here. Well, I did a very traditional story this morning, so I'll say it again because I quite like it. There was once a tailor, and his daughter came and said, "Papa, I am going to have a baby. Will you make me a blanket?" "Of course," said her father, and he laid out some blue cloth, and he got his very good scissors, and he cut and he cut and he cut, and he sewed and he sewed and he sewed. He cut and he cut and he cut, and he sewed and he sewed and he sewed, and he made a beautiful blue blanket to wrap the baby in, and he specially sewed in a little swan on the corner. And when the baby was born, it was wrapped in the blanket. And as the baby grew up, he always took the blanket everywhere. And when he got bigger, he dragged that blanket behind him. And so the blanket got a bit dirty and it got a bit torn. And so the mother took the blanket back to her father and said, "Papa, Papa, what can we do?" And he said, "Don't worry." And he took his great big scissors and he cut and he cut and he cut, and he sewed and he sewed and he sewed, and he cut and he cut and he cut, and he sewed and he sewed and he sewed, and he made that blanket into a beautiful coat for a young boy to go to his first school. And off went the boy to his first school, and he loved his coat. But of course he was a young boy, so he played football, soccer, and he climbed trees. Everybody climbs trees. And so the coat, it got a little bit dirty and a little bit torn. And so the daughter took it back to her father and she said, "Papa, Papa, what can we do?" And he said, "Don't worry." And he took his big cutting scissors and he cut and he cut and he cut. And he sewed and sewed and he sewed. And he cut and he cut and he cut. And he sewed and he sewed and he sewed. And he sewed a waistcoat for a boy who was growing up now. And the boy wore his waistcoat at every occasion. You see, at school he'd have to wear a uniform in the UK. But at the weekends he could wear his special waistcoat to parties, to events. But he still played football and he still climbed trees. And that waistcoat, oh, got a bit dirty and it got a bit torn. And the daughter took it back to her father. "Papa, what can we do?" And he said, "Don't worry." And he got the big scissors and he cut and he cut and he cut. And he sewed and he sewed and he sewed. And he cut and he cut and he cut and he sewed and he sewed and sewed. And he made a tie for a young man who was growing up, who soon would be going out into the world. And the young boy wore his tie everywhere. He wore his tie to interview when he went to go to university. It was his special tie and it seemed to help him. But if you wear a tie too much, it gets worn and it gets torn and it gets dirty and it gets dipped in the soup. Terrible, terrible getting dipped in the soup. And so this time he took it back to his grandfather. And he said, "Grandfather, grandfather, what can we do?" And grandfather said, "Don't worry." And he got his scissors and he cut and he cut and he cut. And he sewed and he sewed and he sewed. And he cut and he cut and he cut. And he sewed and he sewed and he sewed. And he made a beautiful button to go on a young man's coat, a young man who was now going out into the world and working, a young man who had a responsible job. And the young man wore that coat with such pride. And when he was specially worried, he would touch the button and get strength. But one day he was walking along the streets of London, the big old city of London. And that button went off. Ping, it went, and it went up and up and up into the sky and down and down and down and down into a drain. And whoosh came the rain and down it went and it disappeared. And the young man went back to his grandfather and he said, "Grandfather, grandfather, what can I do?" And grandfather said, "Don't worry. You don't always need the thing. You've had the blanket which became your coat, which became your waistcoat and your tie and your button. And it's all there in the story. And now you have to take that story and tell it again and get strength from that story and remember and pass it on." So I passed the last story on like I pass all my stories on. A story comes from me to you to be passed on around the world to wherever you are. And that's the end of my stories for tonight. Thank you very much. Yay!
One could say you just buttoned up this session very well.
Yeah, well, I was thinking as I was telling this story, these are proper cloth buttons on this dress, and they're covered with material, and this is a special kind of button. When you have to cover your buttons in cloth, it's difficult. Can go all terribly wrong.
I love listening to you. I know John Will's probably saying, "Shh, Papa, see." But Sarah, I never tire listening to you. You are enthralling. You're one of the few storytellers I know who could recite the alphabet and keep people enthralled.
I don't think so, because do you know, as a child, I didn't know the alphabet had a bit in the middle. There was a song that went A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, P, Q. I didn't know there was letters in the middle.
Yeah, well, I was in a grade where a boy actually thought the letter was elemental P.
Yeah, that would be me. That would be me. Yes.
No.
I didn't know you had to do every single letter.
I was the kid who wondered why there were only 26 letters.
Yeah, well, if you learn, is it Japanese when there's 2,500 basics?
Yes.
Yes.
But are you wearing purple and pink?
Yeah, pinky ready. Yeah, this is last year's dress that I wore all the way around the world. So, so now I've worn this one. I have to get a new one to wear. Yeah, for next year.
I love listening to you. You were great today.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure about John. He's turned the sound off. Perhaps it's been disconnected.
Hey, Mike.
Sarah, we're really loving the St. Albans connection because, as you know, it's only about I don't know, half an hour's drive from where we live. So we make it. Do you know the Waffle House at the bottom of the?
We do know the Waffle House. Yes.
I wondered if that was the mill when you mentioned the pub. But
no, it's the Fighting Cocks. is supposed to be the oldest pub in England, or one of them, and it is down from the Abbey. It's actually down the other end of the park, and that's where the tunnel is supposed to go.
Fantastic.
But you'd have to go, you know, past the pond with all the ducks and everything, right to the other end where the Waffle House. But if you come round the front of the Waffle House, there's a big stone, which is called a witch's stone, in front of some houses. That's quite an interesting place as well.
I'm sure there's stories to be told.
There are stories to be told for there.
But
Yes.
that's been a great residency. Congratulations on it. That's amazing.
Thank you. It'll go on till I won't finish till next spring, so it's sort of gone over a bit.
Well, hopefully you can bring some of those stories to Marrakesh for us.
Yes, I will be, because definitely the first story is my green man story, because there's a big wooden green man boss that I've taken the story from the
Wonderful. That's great. I'm gonna pop round and prod John with the long stick, I think.
Well, I can finish for myself. I can say, Louis, you have been a splendid guest. Hello,
Yes.
Louis.
Hello, guys. Hi, Hello.
I can see you there. Has your mum come back from the shopping yet, or she's
Yes,
still?
yeah.
Yay! So you off swimming now?
Yes, I am. Yeah,
Have a lovely time swimming.
I will.
Right.
Sarah and Mike, I have this group of kids that I see on Mondays, and they study different cultures. And right now we're studying Morocco. And so I have to tell Moroccan tales.
There must be cow.
Well, Mike's been there once or twice, I think. He'll tell you a bit. Great stories, Sarah.
Thank
Like
you.
your crown, Babasi. Good to see you, Louis. Good to see you. And what have we got coming up? Got Dispenser next Friday.
All right.
Yeah, that'd be good. And then we get into the rounds. Nothing on the Sunday, but Sunday after that is Worldwide Story Round, etc., etc. Thank you, Waleed, for flying the magic carpet. Thank you, Mike, for clocking in. And thank you, cute Sir, Mr. President, King, Louis, Lindsay, Timmins, for your weekly program.
Hooray!
All right.
Wow, I like little hearts, Waleed. Good night, everyone. Good day, good afternoon.
Don't get to
On
sneeze.
the way to lunch.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Lucy. I mean, Lucy. Right, everybody. It's good seeing everybody. Can't wait to get back to Marrakesh.
To be continued.
Yeah.
To be continued.
Bye, bye, guys.